Okay, so I wanted to answer a question that I get a lot about my own diet and my own nutrition. A lot of people ask me what kind of things I eat and what kind of things they'll be able to eat someday. They want to hear like how my diet has transitioned when I'm putting them on these very strict therapeutic diets. And they're like, okay, but what is this going to look like long term? Like, what do you do? And there's a lot of confusion out there because a lot of people think of therapeutic diets as symptom reducing diets. And I actually don't really use those in my practice very much. I will only use those if people are really in an acute state of illness where we can't move forward with any kind of therapeutic protocol because their symptoms are too intense day to day and we need to stabilize them first. It's only in those kinds of situations that I will do a symptom reduction diet. For the most part, or sometimes the other situation would be if someone's not ready to do a therapeutic diet, and then I'll just say, like, okay, let's just get you to a place where we can reduce your symptoms a little bit so you're a little more functional day to day. So I'll do that as well. That's absolutely appropriate. But uh, if you are really doing a healing diet, part of the idea of that is that you shouldn't have to do it forever, right? And so you're gonna have to do it longer than, a lot of people will put these like 30-day gut cleanses out there, things like that. And really, for most people, it's gonna take more than 30 days to reset the gut. Usually, I tell people between 6 months and 2 years is really what you need to rebuild the immune system, rebuild the nervous system, depending on the severity and complexity and length of your illness. So I'm not talking about super short term, but I'm also not talking about super long term, right? A lot of people think that I'm in remission because I stick to a low histamine diet, and I don't. I don't eat a low histamine diet at all anymore, where in the past I had to eat an extremely strict low histamine diet or I was having very intensive symptoms. So that's how you know that true healing has happened if you can expand your diet and you can expand the diversity of what you're eating and you don't have your symptoms return. And that's really what I like to do with people, and that's why I tend to put people on such intensive dietary protocols, is because I'd rather have you do the hard work now and be able to be more flexible, 2-3 years into the future, than be stuck on a semi-restrictive diet forever. So that's my bias with how I go about designing my protocols. But it means that also what someone needs to heal in different parts of their journey is going to look different. So that's why I can't just give a universal answer around like what kind of diet do you need to heal, because it's going to look different in different stages. And for me, it has looked different as well. First of all, what I've needed in order to keep my symptoms at bay, what I've needed to heal, and what I've needed to heal different layers of repair that my body has needed to do has looked different. So the diet I have eaten over the course of my journey has been very, very different. And so it's hard for me to even answer the question like, well, what is your diet like, because it's looked so different depending on what my body has needed at that time. Like I said before, I ate a very strict anti-inflammatory kind of paleo-ish low histamine diet when I first started healing, and that is what stabilized me enough to actually heal. But I had to do that over the course of a year when I first started healing because I was so ill and having such intense symptoms. Once I was stable enough, I was able to go through kind of a more intensive version of the intro gaps protocol that my mentor Mary Ruddick has worked on developing, and it's a very similar diet to what I use in my practice now when I'm doing really intensive gut resets with people. So that's what I did in the most intensive part of my healing. That was the most intense detox I have ever been through, and that is what really gave me a leg up on having to be stuck on a symptom reduction diet forever. It was from that point that I could really start expanding things and adding things without my symptoms returning. So I was able to transition away from a low histamine diet after I went through that because I had healed enough that my body was no longer responding to histamines in food, which was wonderful because a low histamine diet is not super fun. A lot of the decadent foods that you can even eat on a paleo or a keto type of diet you can't do on a low histamine diet. So that's always something I try to get people off, is like the low histamine parameters, because it is not a fun thing long term. So yeah, I don't eat a low histamine diet at all anymore. I didn't have to ever since I went through that intensive gut reset. It was after that, about a year after that, that I realized I had a really big problem with oxalates, as I was realizing the load of heavy metal toxicity that my body was dealing with. My body hangs on to oxalates, which binds to heavy metals. I do not detoxify heavy metals or oxalates at all very well naturally, and so I really have to support that. And so that's when I ended up doing a more intensive carnivore style diet, so really let my body detoxify from oxalates, which has continued on and off for years, honestly, because that is a really heavy load that a lot of people carry without realizing it. So that's been a really huge step in my healing, was really getting rid of almost all plant foods for some time to let my body really detoxify from the oxalate and heavy metal load. That being said, after doing that for about a year, my bile system got really clogged up with all the fact that I was eating very high fat and I was detoxifying at the same time. So my pancreas and gallbladder and liver really became overwhelmed and overworked at that time. And it was actually around that time that I had to introduce higher amounts of plant foods into my diet in order to take advantage of the soluble fiber in plants that can have such a detoxifying effect to the bile system, to the gallbladder, to the liver. A lot of nutrients in plants are very, very cleansing for the gallbladder and the liver, and really help to bind to toxins, to help pull out kind of the heavy toxins that are causing the bile to become sluggish and causing malabsorption and digestion of fats, which is a very common thing to happen. A lot of times people will do these very animal-based diets and thrive on it, and eventually their body starts struggling with digesting the high amount of fats because they've gotten so sluggish with all the toxins that they've been releasing over the years, whether it's heavy metals or toxins from the microbiome reset that you've done. As bacteria dies off, it releases toxins, and so many people go through this experience where they are doing really well on an animal-based diet, and then they end up having to introduce more plants for that high soluble fiber to clear out the bile system. So that's kind of, and also once you really reset your gut and you are really growing a lot more healthy balance of bacteria there, it is absolutely acceptable to reintroduce starches. A lot of times in my work, I think people get the impression that starch and sugar is just bad. Right? It's always bad, because I'm always like, no, don't touch the starches, you're going to sabotage your progress. But that's only when you're really in that acute healing stage of that, under 2 years of really intensive gut reset that a lot of people have to go through. Once you're able to do that, it's absolutely acceptable to be eating a higher amount of starch and even natural sugars in your diet. I don't ever recommend that people go pounding cane sugar or refined flour or anything like that, but traditional starches, traditional sugars can absolutely be appropriate at this stage. And so I did that as well. I started introducing a lot of traditional starches like cassava, plantain, even sweet potatoes, even things like lentils or other legumes, chickpeas, things like that. They must be properly prepared, right? I always have this bias towards ancestral knowledge when it comes to nutrition. And so if you're going to reintroduce those foods, you really have to do it in a traditional way. Where you properly prepare them, you do the soaking or the sprouting, the long cook times, things like that, to reduce the amount of toxicity as traditional peoples have the wisdom around. So I have absolutely done that, and it did really improve the health of my gut and my gallbladder and pancreas and liver to reintroduce those. But I still don't, deal with oxalates well, and a lot of those plant foods that are very good for the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas are not so good when you don't break down oxalates. So what I often will do is I will kind of cycle between a more animal-based diet and a more traditional starch-based or traditional plant-based diet, so that and every time I do get rid of those oxalates that I have accumulated. I can see it in my urine, and it's quite striking. Once you realize that this is an issue, it's pretty hard to ignore. So I will never go like fully hard on the plants probably ever again. I will always cycle through so that it does not accumulate as it did for me in the past. Now, that being said, you do not have to introduce starches and you do not have to introduce soluble fiber if you don't want to and if you're doing well. There are many people who seem to do long term very, very well on a very meat heavy ketogenic or even carnivore diet, and they don't have to do it anymore. You know, they could expand their diet and not get their symptoms returning, but they actually end up preferring it. And I often will go through phases of this, especially in the winter when it makes more sense, ancestrally speaking as well, where I just won't want plants as much in my diet and I will eat a little bit more animal based just as my body wants it. But then other times, you know, the idea of meat and fat feels kind of heavy and icky in my body, and I realize that I want to actually be going a little bit heavier on the plants. My body must need to be doing some cleansing in that way. And so once you really reset the microbiome, you really can go intuitively about this, and you can notice your patterns of digestion. You can notice how well you're absorbing and breaking down fats. You can notice how well you're absorbing and breaking down starches and fibers in the plants you're eating. And you can kind of go by that internal sensation of like what sounds good, and usually that will fluctuate with the seasons and the cycles that your body goes through. You know, I always tell people you cannot trust your cravings when you're sick, because your brain is being hijacked by the microbes in your gut, and you just cannot trust yourself. You really can't. So you have to be really disciplined. But once things are more balanced and you're in remission and you're not having these wild sweet cravings anymore, you really can trust that. Like, there may be times when more fruit does sound good to your body, and your body must be utilizing those sugars for something. There's going to be times when root vegetables and starches are going to sound really good, and your body's probably using the soluble fiber for something. There's going to be times when a more animal-based way of eating sounds good, and your body probably needs that raw material to build and repair. So that's a very long explanation of what my diet looks like now. It really cycles depending on my needs, and what I want for my clients is to be able to have the freedom to do the same thing, to be able to really go by their intuition and go by their needs, and not have their symptoms return, you know, just be kind of continuing to pull back on new layers of their own health. You know, what I recommend for my clients is not necessarily what I'm doing, and that's because I'm at a different stage. So I hope this was a helpful video breakdown of my current eating habits.